Alright guys, welcome to the first video of the next unit, which is going to be the Gilded Age. And in this video we're talking about a lot of different people, and I know that it sounds horrible guys, so just bear with me. Alright, so what is the Gilded Age? The novelist Mark Twain, which you guys should know, wrote a book in 1873 called The Gilded Age, and in it he depicts American society as gilded or having a rotten core covered in gold paint. So it was the idea of this wealth, which is supposed to be the gold, covering up all the issues and problems underneath. And the actual word gilded means dipped in gold, to cover up something of less value. So this whole time period that we're covering, this next unit, is known as the Gilded Age. Now, it's after Civil War, the 15th Amendment gets passed. And the 15th Amendment says that state governments are prohibited from denying someone the right to vote because of race, color, previous condition of servitude. But after the Reconstruction period, Southern states got around this by passing a number of other restrictive measures. So the poll tax, which required voters to pay a tax to vote, began in Georgia, and it cost voters $1 or $2 to vote, but it cuts out the poor African Americans that couldn't afford it. The states also required voters to pass a literacy test, and because African Americans had been denied an education, this restriction also disqualified many of them as voters. And then finally you had the southern states passing the grandfather clause, which allowed a person to vote as long as the ancestor had also voted prior to 1866. Of course, the ancestors of the black freemen did not vote because they were enslaved, but the ancestors of many whites did. So in other words, the grandfather clause allowed poor, illiterate whites to vote, but not blacks. Some southern states also established all-white primaries, meaning that whites had a voice in selecting who actually ran in the general election. And in addition, whites resorted to violence to keeping African Americans from participating in the political process. So as a result of these actions, throughout the Deep South, black participation in politics fell dramatically. And you could tell in this chart, and this is in South Carolina, the red line of the black voters and how that fell off dramatically in the period of 20 years. Following the 1876 presidential election, President Hayes removed the federal troops from the South, so Reconstruction was over. And this allowed southern states to reassert their control over African Americans without concern of the federal government intervening. So the southern governments enacted various measures in what becomes known as the Jim Crow laws. And Jim Crow laws basically keeps blacks and whites segregated or apart in all these different areas, in anything that's basically public. You have an extremely important court case come up in the Jim Crow South, and that's Plessy versus Ferguson. It happens in 1896, where you have a man by the name of Homer Plessy, who was an African American, sat on the train that was reserved for whites only. He was arrested when he refused to get up and move to the colored train. Now, Louisiana, a few years earlier, had passed a law called the Separate Car Act that had the separate facilities for black and whites. And in Plessy's argument during his court case, he says that this law, the Separate Car Act, violates the 14th Amendment for equality. And the Supreme Court says, in the Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court argues that as long as states maintain separate but equal facilities, it does not violate the 14th Amendment. In reality, separate but equal was rarely equal. For example, in 1915, South Carolina spent nearly $14 on every white student, but less than $3 on every black student. So were the schools separate? Yes. But were they equal? Absolutely not. So in Plessy versus Ferguson in 1986, the Supreme Court upholds the constitutionality of the Jim Crow laws, separate but equal. Now let's think. Can separate treatment ever really be equal treatment? What does it mean to be treated equally? And are there some situations where separate treatment is equal treatment? You have two cases over here. Think about what is the equal treatment for each of these individuals in this case, and we are going to discuss this in class tomorrow, guys. Now, as we are coming about, the Jim Crow South, lots of different people start popping up in support of African American rights. So one of them is known as Booker T. Washington. He argues that African Americans need to accommodate themselves to segregation, and they should not focus their energies on overturning Jim Crow. Instead, you should build up your economic resources, get a reputation for being hardworking, for being honest, for contributing to society in a positive manner, and then worry about getting equality. Booker T. Washington, poured his energies into the Tuskegee Institute, which is in Alabama, and the Tuskegee Institute becomes known for providing industrial education, aka vocational education. And such an education would prepare African Americans to exercise their privileges of citizenship. So that's what he thought. Don't worry about overturning Jim Crow, just worry about establishing yourself. W.E.B. Du Bois also was around during the period of time that Booker T. Washington was, but he had a little bit of a different view. So he was from Massachusetts. He gets a PhD from Harvard in 1896, and he criticizes Booker T. Washington for Washington's willingness to accommodate Southern whites. He thought that they should not wait and just limit themselves to vocational education. They should demand immediate and full equality. Ida B. Wells, and we're going to talk about her also when we talk about women's suffrage. But Ida B. Wells was born into slavery in 1862. She grew up in Mississippi. Her dad was a prominent businessman and, raised her to fight for the rights of African Americans. And as a young adult, as a young woman, she was a school teacher, active in her church. She had a newspaper called Free Speech. She wrote, a number of articles about the mistreatment of blacks, but she really steps out into the activist position in 1892 when a mob attacks her close friends in Memphis and lynches them. And so she becomes a big supporter or a big proponent of attacking the practice of lynching in the South. She writes a number of pamphlets that awakens the nation about the things that are happening in the South and how it's basically legalized murder. And she goes into Europe talking about this as well, the lynching of African Americans and how no one is doing anything about it in the South. So let's think. We were just talking about lynchings with Ida B. Wells. Why did most of the lynchings occur in the South? The darker the color on the map, the more lynchings that occurred that particular year. So why was most of these lynchings occurring in the South? Or why were most of these lynchings occurring in the South? All right, so let's shift a little bit from African Americans and let's just talk about inequality in general. And that brings us to women. So you have two women over here. You have Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Now, expanding the rights of African Americans left some women's rights activists like Susan B. Anthony angry. And Anthony favored abolishing slavery, yet she felt betrayed when the 14th and 15th Amendments were passed because it applied to strictly African American men and not women. So in 1872, Anthony votes in an election in Rochester, New York, which is illegal. And she ultimately goes to trial for it. And she basically says, she delivers a speech and it's called, "Is it a crime for a citizen of the United States to vote?" So she's basically trying to convince people to give women the right to vote. It fails, but it starts a movement. By the time that she dies in 1906, 4 states had already allowed women the right to vote, and they were pretty much all out west: Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho. But she starts this off with her friend, the National Women's Suffrage Association, and it picks up steam even after she's passed on. By 1900, 1/3 of all college students were women. Frances Willard, who led the Women's Christian Temperance Union, was working to ban the sale of liquor. She argued that women needed the right to vote to prohibit the sale of alcohol because alcohol was the cause of a variety of problems in American society. And she also promoted other social causes such as public health and welfare reform. But women, right along with African Americans, were fighting for equality at this period of time, right alongside each other. So let's think. You have here two different points of views about women earning less than men. And I want you to think over here, how do the two writers agree and how do they disagree? And then finally, a little bit about affirmative action. So affirmative action makes it possible for women and minorities to compete in the workplace. Which of these quoted women might actually support it? So revert back to the to this over here if you need to. Alright guys, we've reached the end of this video. I know I sounded horrible and I apologize for it. But if you're able to answer these 5 questions, then you are set. See you guys tomorrow in class.